Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for the introduction, and Kutcha for the words, which move and stir me to action. I come to you as an Afro-Latino professor who lives on unceded land of the Lenape peoples and who works for an institution that sits on those lands. One thought that I had while listening to Kutcha just now is that in the staging and design of this Zoom webinar, we are also being invited to participate in a conversation about the degree to which telecommunications infrastructure upon which we have become completely dependent the shift to online learning is in itself implicated in circuits of settler colonialism and extractive capitalism. So this is something that I wanted to set up by way of transitioning from Kutcha's remarks to my own. I want to talk today about the work of decolonization within a field that has historically been implicated in settler colonialism and that to this day resists decolonization in the formations of value to which it subscribes, and in the modalities and technologies of violence that it wields. This is the field of classics. To introduce my remarks, I want to say a few words about an exchange that I had with a colleague over the summer in the aftermath of a faculty letter to which I contributed time, energy, and some words, along with three other colleagues in different departments. In the aftermath of the faculty letters, submission to our university administration, departmental colleague and I had a conversation in which she, not an ally of the letter, stated that all she wanted to do was teach, and that she viewed with cynicism and skepticism the motivations of some of the contributors to the faculty letter, and by implication, of course, she also viewed with skepticism my motivations for doing this kind of work. Her message was echoed at a faculty town hall that took place at Princeton just this Monday, at which several faculty members opened by reading statements in which they bellyached about the loss of freedom of speech and the threat posed by cancel culture, and their worries that in the demands being put forward by faculty, especially faculty who are invested in the work of decolonizing the curriculum and moving towards a more anti-racist university, what was at stake in their view was the insidious creep of authoritarianism, and authoritarianism that would police their right to be heard, and that would limit their unfettered exercise of free speech and free thought. The faculty meeting, the town hall, was one that I chose not to attend, although I received regular text updates from people who did, because I felt at the end of the day that faculty town halls like this were precisely the kinds of staging grounds for the declaration of a renewed commitment to the predominantly white ethos of this institution that I did not want to witness firsthand. And here, the question that I have repeatedly voiced in conversations with some of my colleagues is really at its core this: how can I communicate to you? How can I communicate to you persuasively that authoritarianism is here, that it has been here, and that the work of racial capitalism has deprived many of us of any opportunity whatsoever to even think about the exercise of these freedoms that you prize. And that furthermore, if there is something emancipatory that comes from the subjection to these circuits of racial capitalism, it is that we have a much better critique of what it means to wield knowledge and speech responsibly than you do. And that critique is the one that you should be seeking to cultivate instead of bellyaching about the presumptive loss of your right to free speech and unfettered free speech that you have wielded to tremendous harm, right? I say this as someone whose professional training has unfolded within a discipline that remains to this day stake to constructions of power and of hegemonic power in particular. The discipline of classics, the name and historical configuration of which as discipline have presupposed an anti-decolonizing stance, has a lot of work to do as a discipline if it is going to get anywhere close to the kinds of comprehensive decolonization that would move beyond the realm of metaphor and into the realm of substantive praxis. For one, the formulation of the field of classics as a classical field is reliant on the assumption that there is a specific and monolithic notion of the classical that is imbued with a value that exceeds or overrides claims to classicism that other traditions might make. So the commitment to decolonization within this space demands an unthinking and undoing of some of the discipline's core tenets and constitutive foundations, of which I'll name only three. First, the discipline's ascription and accumulation of value to itself within a white supremacist framework, with implicit and explicit denigrations of other disciplinary modes and practices in the process. Second is the discipline's institutionalization in the global north as a medium for an incubator of white supremacy, in lockstep with the intensification of the transatlantic slave trades, Euro-American settler colonialism, and the rise and consolidation of racial capitalism. The discipline, from its roots, is wired through these circuits of domination. There is no way to do a responsible disciplinary history that doesn't acknowledge this, and that it is shocking when you look at this histories of this field, so little of this work has been. And finally, I'll note the internalized discourse of crisis, of imminent decline, of assault from the outside that has become fetishistic within classics itself. And this is a discourse that conceals and mystifies forms of social exploitation and domination in which the discipline is complicit, but which it dares not name to itself, right? For me, and for those of us within this disciplinary space who have committed ourselves to the work of decolonizing, it should be stressed that the work of decolonizing, for reasons that Kutcha has brought out already, is not, cannot, never could be about accumulating persons from groups historically underrepresented at predominantly white institutions for show and tell. It is about interrogating and in many cases demolishing longstanding hierarchies and building back up to a knowledge practice and way of inhabiting forms of knowledge that is not just flexible, capacious, and equitable, but redistributive. That is the name of the game. Decolonizing the curriculum in classics thus requires several moves, which I'll spell out in schematic fashion. It will require a critical reordering of the discipline's ideological commitments, and that begins with a name. So a deprovincialization of specific disciplinary practices that have historically colluded with and to the present day remain in hoc to the material forms of subjection I mentioned earlier has to take stock of the name classics. It also has to take stock of the technologies that around which the discipline has coalesced. And I'll name one technology for the purposes of illustration. This is the practice of philology as enshrined in the history of textual criticism and textual transmission. This is a practice that evolves together with race science, as scholars in multiple fields have pointed out. So for example, Yi John Lin's The Erotic Life of Manuscripts, New Testament Textual Criticism in the Biological Sciences, which came out in 2016. And in order to do the work of decolonization and decolonizing philology, we would have to honor Patrice Rankine's call in a 2019 article in which, among other arguments, he states quite directly, the first move that we can make towards truth would be to abandon the pretense of pure philology that has been so fundamental to the field. I do not say to abandon the pursuit of language proficiency. What I mean is that a pure philology unmixed with contemporary realities is and always has been a pretense and a pernicious lie. Philology is not a practice that confers proof of merit, end quote. Further to this point, we have to honor and make space for the integration of those approaches in critical race studies and indigenous studies, whose high-level granularity in documenting the connivance of disciplinary formations with hegemonic structures that they subtend has been so exemplary. So here, it's not only a matter of reading Black writers and reading indigenous writers, it's also a matter of keeping in clear focus Benny Liu's provocation, which I'll quote, whose scholarship counts as scholarship in my field, end quote. This requires doing critical genealogies. And in this respect, I'll simply note that one of our panelists has done exemplary work in tracking the genealogies of race in historiography. And that this is the kind of work documenting critically how the formation of a discipline and a disciplinary mode of practice is intimately embedded within notions of racial science that remains to be done for classics as a discipline writ large. The other important aspect of this, and then I'll turn to some specific illustrations of how this is carried out in the classroom, is that especially in teaching and writing about subjects such as classical reception, the study of how classical traditions, not just Greco-Roman ones, are received and see their meanings recomposed and reconstituted by interpretive communities across time and space, we have to resist the allure of what Rosa Andujar in a 2019 address termed happy face classics. In the context of the multicultural 21st century university, there's a tendency to showcase these acts of receiving and negotiating traditions that were previously demarcated and delineated as Euro-American Western civilizational ones, as the kinds of traditions in which folks of color can see themselves as active interlocutors. And so to this end, you usually have classes that are set up such that they move from, say, Sophocles' Antigone to the reception of Antigone, either in Africa or the African diaspora, or in Caribbean context, or in North America, so on and so forth. But what Andujar challenges us in terming this Happy Face Classics is to entertain the proposition that these modes of reception are being presented as a way of duping folks into participating in their own subjection. And that this is something that we must avoid at all costs, not only because at the end of the day, these actions serve simply to reify and reconsolidate the hegemony of a predominantly white land, but also because they inhibit the work of epistemic justice that would be necessary for the radical emancipatory project that would be required as a precondition of seeing through decolonization successfully. This also means that we have to model the fact that disciplinary perspectives that hold the field to account, that stress the bad as well as the notionally good, aren't somehow deleterious to the field's flourishing or to its future prospects. Because it's only by committing to a decolonizing displacement that actively embraces the recognition and surrender of institutionalized privilege in order to seek the creation of a collaborative and equitable ecology, that something like a classics reconstituted as critical ancient world studies would have a meaningful 21st century existence. This means, among other things, that we have to entertain seriously the ethical virtue of allowing classics in its current form to die as a discipline. Here are a few quick examples that I'll cite of how one might go about the task of doing this in the classroom. I'm going to refer to teaching that I'm doing right now and teaching from which I've drawn inspiration and sustenance. So this term I'm teaching a course on citizenship. It's a course entitled Citizenships Ancient and Modern. And citizenship is a topic, especially in predominantly white institutions, that has been taught and continues to be taught in an uncompromisingly white supremacist manner. Here's the course description for the course for the class at Princeton this fall, and then I'll say a few words about how from the setup and first week of the class, we've tried to proceed from the recognition that these older modes, these hegemonic modes of narrating histories of citizenship need to be destabilized and overthrown. Quote, "The extrajudicial murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor have brought renewed and overdue attention to the fatal designs of civic inequality. These designs and the debates over the assignment, withholding, or citizen protections from which they emerge have a long and violent history. In this course, we will attempt to map a history of citizenship as concept and as institution from the ancient Mediterranean world to the 21st century. Some of the questions to be tackled include: who and what is a citizen? What are the prerogatives and rights that come with citizenship? Who is eligible to be or become a citizen? How are racial and gendered exclusions wired into the historical legacies and present-day practices of citizenship? How is citizenship imagined and narrated? What does it mean to be a global citizen? And so on. Although we will make much fuss over the ancient Mediterranean in the first half of the course, one objective of this course is to determine whether and to what degree such an orientation makes sense. To arrive at this determination, we will experiment with a range of different historical and conceptual genealogies for modern frameworks of citizenship. Our readings will run the gamut from poetry and narrative fiction to political theory and narrative nonfiction. The course begins with the Book of Ruth, but as read through Gail Yee's 2009 article that brings Ruth into the contemporary moment of Asian American experiences, and does so with a deliberate and avowed intention of toggling between the model minority and perpetual foreigner as paradigms in the history of citizenship that are best addressed by looking both at the situatedness of contemporary immigrants within the 21st century landscape and the kinds of texts that speak to the tensions of immigration unfolding across space and time, beginning with Ruth, but certainly one can multiply other examples. There is another dimension to this, though, and it's here that I want to end, picking up along the way the final question that we were provided in advance of this panel to chew on and deliberate over. There is fundamentally in classics a tension with how you represent the interface between an exemplary past that is constituted as classics classical and the ethical demands of the contemporary moment. And here, for the purposes of framing this debate in the context of the citizenship class and in other courses that I teach on the comparative and global history of slavery, I've been fond of making use of a passage from Saidiya Hartman's work that I find very moving, because it seems to me to distill quite elegantly the ethical concerns that are at their core driving my work in reimagining curricula. This is a passage from Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route, and I'll quote it in full. I too live in the time of slavery, Hartman writes, by which I mean I'm living in the future created by it. It is the ongoing crisis of citizenship. Questions first posed in 1773 about the disparity between the sublime ideal of freedom and the facts of blackness are uncannily relevant today. The echoes could be heard in a plea still waiting for an answer, chalked onto a rooftop in the 9th Ward of New Orleans. Help, the water's rising, please. 6 people are trapped on the roof and 2 of them are waving American flags, hoping against the odds that the stars and stripes might make their plight visible, keep them afloat, and demonstrate unequivocally, we are citizens too. But the anxiety and the doubt fueling that assertion was made plain by the photograph's caption, castaway, end quote. With the kinds of teaching that I and others doing this work in classics have tried to model over the past few years, it's important never to lose sight of the fact that the proposition baked into the historical and disciplinary figuration of classics, i.e. that there is a past that is clearly demarcated as being past and one that we can approach with this veneer of objectivity, is one that has to be demolished. The past not only retains its force over the present, it is in fact a hegemonic projection into the present. And for that reason alone, reinterrogating the classics and its foundations requires an attention to the living force of that past in the present that is most vividly and tangibly realized by a commitment to decolonization. Hartman's passage is also evocative for me for another reason, one that's allied to the project to which the citizenship course subscribes and that infuses some of my other work. The flooding is happening now. I mean, the flooding is happening right now. The flooding is happening in connection with Sally. It's happening all around the world as a consequence of global climate change, of anthropogenic climate change. And it is a responsibility to the human and non-human communities that are altered and see their lives forever shattered by this flooding that should animate the work that we do in disciplines such as classics that have for so long pretended, even as they benefit from and hoard the privileges of their participation in settler colonialist exploitation of natural ecologies, that they can somehow remain aloof from the fray and not put their commitments on the table. So with that, I'll yield the floor. Thank you so much, and I'm looking very much forward to our discussion.